1990, the quiet suburban community of Wellington, Florida was rocked by a shocking and mysterious crime that would baffle investigators for decades. Marlene Warren, a well-liked and seemingly ordinary woman, was brutally gunned down at her doorstep by a clown wearing a bright orange wig and a red nose. The case of the killer clown sent shockwaves through the nation, leaving both law enforcement and the public perplexed. Let's get into it. It was a Saturday morning of Memorial Day weekend on May 26, 1990, when 40-year-old Marlene Warren was in her home in Wellington, Florida. She was having breakfast with her son, 21-year-old Joe Aarons, who was recovering from a broken leg. A few of his friends were also there, and they saw someone pulling up to the home. A bright-colored figure started towards the door. The clown knocked, and when Marlene opened the door, she was faced with a fully dressed clown with the face paint, a red nose, and an orange wig looking back at her. The clown had a basket of carnations and 2 Mylar balloons, one saying "You're the greatest." Marlene said, "Oh, how nice," as she reached for the gifts the clown was handing over. Once the gifts left the clown's hands, that was when they reached into their pockets and pulled out a handgun. The clown then pointed the gun right at Marlene's face and pulled the trigger. Then the clown simply turned around and slowly walked away, leaving Marlene in the entryway. Joe, having witnessed it, jumped to his mother's side. He remembered looking around and calling out for something, but now he can't remember what he'd said. He saw the clown look back at him, and he remembered seeing brown eyes, though he couldn't identify the person behind the makeup. The clown then got into a white Chrysler LeBaron convertible before speeding off. Joe picked up the phone and called 911. He told the dispatcher that his mother had been shot and the address before he grabbed the car keys, and even with the cast, he attempted to chase down the clown. When he stopped being able to see the vehicle, he returned to his mother. By that time, police and paramedics had arrived. Marlene was rushed to the hospital, where she stayed in a coma until she succumbed to her injuries 2 days later. Joe is said that he stayed with his mother in the hospital, begging her to stay with him and that he loved her. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Marlene was born on April 15, 1950 in Mount Clemens, Michigan. In 1965, she married her high school sweetheart, John Aarons, at only 15 years old and had her first son, Johnny Jr. They had their second child, another son named Joey, a few years later. Tragedy struck the young family only 5 years after they were married. Marlene's husband, John, died in a car accident, leaving the 20-year-old with 2 very young children. 2 years later, she met Michael Warren. She was 22 when he was 19. Michael Warren grew up in a small suburb in Detroit, and the two really seemed to hit it off. The couple had a whirlwind romance, and Marlene was swept off her feet. Michael also doted on her 2 young sons, and soon the couple married. After their wedding, the couple left Michigan for sunny Florida, where Michael's family lived. Once in Florida, Michael became a meat factory inspector. But the couple had also started dabbling in the real estate business and began investing heavily in rental properties. Marlene had a wide range of interests. She was intelligent. She was good with the growing businesses. She was a devoted mother, and she loved art. She was a particularly skilled painter, and one of her favorite things to paint were clowns. Marlene mostly ran the property businesses by herself, and many of the properties were in her name. It had been going so well that in 1984, Michael was able to quit his job as an inspector and start his own company, a used car and rental dealership called Bargain Motors. Then they built their dream home on an acre of land in Wellington, an affluent and exclusive area of Florida. It was home to many celebrities who owned expansive properties to get away from the bustle of Miami or Fort Lauderdale. Its many gated communities boasted a private escape, and the best that Florida had to offer. The population in the area boomed in the 1980s as luxury residential communities moved into the area. One such community was the Aero Club, and that was where Michael and Marlene Warren decided to build a home. It was well regarded as an extremely safe residential area. Many of the residents were families of wealthy Florida business owners, entrepreneurs, and working professionals. At the time, it was a kind of community where everyone knew everyone and ran similar social circles. It was a neighborhood that Marlene thrived in. She was involved in the community. She enjoyed going to parties and the country club. However, Michael Warren stuck out as a loner. Michael had kind of been known in the community as having a, quote, used car salesman personality, with many neighbors believing that he'd sell his own mother for a buck. He was described as extremely confident, but there had always been a vibe that he wasn't the kind of person that you could trust. There had also been a few incidents that concerned those who knew him. Michael got really into flying. He got his pilot's license and bought a plane. But the plane was stolen and turned up crashed with an engine that had been tampered with. He also loved horse racing and would eventually start purchasing thoroughbred horses. But in another strange coincidence, his horses were also stolen and killed. The insurance payouts had been significant in both cases. Then Michael had a run-in with the law in 1983. At his used car dealership, he was busted for tampering with the odometers on the vehicles he sold. Michael pleaded guilty to the charge, but avoided prison, only serving 18 months of probation. One sentence, he transferred the automotive business to Marlene in 1985. She was still the owner on paper when she died. The two were married for 20 years, but things had started to get rocky. Marlene's business was extremely successful, and her two sons were also involved in helping her out with the business. She had a net worth of $1.1 million all on her own. Michael had also started to drift from the family, spending more and more time traveling at the used car lot and hanging out with his friends. Marlene had started making comments to her mother that things weren't really working out anymore. But the businesses would make a divorce complicated, with many of the family's assets being in Marlene's name. Then in 1988, Marlene experienced a second horrific tragedy in her life. Her eldest son John died in a car accident. It was reported that he'd failed to stop at a stop sign and hit a car going through the intersection. The person in the other vehicle survived with minor injuries. Marlene launched a lawsuit with the city, alleging that the stop sign her son had failed to stop at had been actually removed for construction and had not been replaced at, and that had contributed to the car accident that killed her son. Also later that year, her younger son was arrested and put on probation for assault. Joey had been experiencing some difficulties following his brother's death. And it was after John's death that Mike and Marlene's marriage really started to deteriorate. The two began to fight constantly. In 1990, the Warrens really only had one neighbor, and their neighbors were walking their dog on May 26th, when they heard what they had believed was a nail gun going off before seeing Joe screaming, a white Chrysler LeBaron speeding down the road. The neighbors also called 911 after realizing what had happened the day Marlene was shot. The investigation started right away. Very quickly, police had evidence coming in from all directions. Joe had seen the clown but couldn't identify who it was. Joe had originally described the clown as having big hands and broad shoulders, so the media reported that it was a male suspect wearing a clown costume. Police would also find the LeBaron that they believed had been used in the murder abandoned on May 30th, parked at a Winn-Dixie grocery store parking lot. The white Chrys of the LeBaron had been reported stolen on April 14th by Payless Car Rentals. A couple that's never been named in the media. They rented the vehicle from Payless Cars, and when they went to return the vehicle to Payless, they realized that they didn't have the address for drop-off. They checked the phone book for the company and saw an ad for what they believed was Payless Cars. When they called the number, the person gave them the address and told them to park it outside of the lot and leave the keys tucked under the windshield wiper. The couple did what the company said, but it felt weird. They returned to find the car missing. When they got in touch with Payless Car Rentals, they discovered that they had called the wrong rental company. The company they had left the car at was Bargain Motors, the company owned by the Warrens. The ad that they had responded to had been purposely made to deceptively look like it was the Payless company, when in fact it was Michael's business number on the ad. Michael Warren would become a quick suspect for the police, but he had an alibi for the time of his wife's murder. He had been in a car with some of his racing friends on the way to some horse racing. His alibi meant that he couldn't have been the shooter, but police didn't rule him out completely. Throughout the investigation, the police discovered that Marlene had talked to her friends and family and that she had expressed wanting to leave Michael because he was having an affair. She had told her mother that if anything happened to her, Michael was probably the one who did it. Her mother would explain that Marlene had even told her where to find money that she'd hidden in case anything happened. If the couple had divorced, it would have cost Michael considerably, with almost all of the assets being in Marlene's name. With Michael having an airtight alibi, law enforcement still didn't know who pulled the trigger. Crime scene photos, funeral pictures, these are just some of the images tied to a Wellington killer clown cold case murder made public for the first time. The photos show pictures of detectives searching a home on Takeoff Place, the same home where 40-year-old Marlene Warren was gunned down by a killer dressed in a clown costume. Detectives also wanted to know who was the other woman in Michael's life. Who was he having an affair with? Wasn't an affair really happening? The police interviewed employees of the Warrens, family members and colleagues. Only one name came up consistently: Sheila Keene, someone who worked closely with Bargain Motors. Sheila Keene, who was 27 in 1990, and her husband, 46-year-old Richard Keene, owned a car repossession business together. They often worked with the Warrens, repossessing vehicles when people hadn't managed to make their payments. Police interviewed Richard Keene first, who told them he was estranged from his wife for years and that he'd heard that she was having an affair with Michael Warren. Sheila and Michael were known to take long business lunches together, and their relationship had been an open secret at Bargain Motors. However, 2 weeks before the shooting, employees at Bargain Motors noticed an abrupt absence of Sheila's presence at the lot. Both Sheila and Michael denied having an affair with law enforcement. Sheila was born Sheila Sheltra. She was known to be beautiful with long brown hair and brown eyes. She had grown up in Central Florida in the agricultural area. Sheila was strong and independent, and many described her as a force to be reckoned with. She was fearless. Sheila had always been described as kind of wild. She was beautiful and she loved the attention that she got from men. And from an early age, she started to get involved with much older men. She had met Richard Keene when she was a teenager, and he was nearly 20 years older than she was. And Keene wasn't exactly the kind of person that you'd want your young daughter dating. He was a very vocal member of the KKK and involved in the drug trade. Sheila would end up marrying Keene, and shortly after their marriage, Keene was busted for trafficking cannabis and sentenced 10 years in prison. Sheila ended up moving to Georgia to be closer to Keene while he served his prison sentence. While Keene was in prison, Sheila started to get in trouble with the law herself. She was busted twice for theft. By 1990, their relationship had soured. Sheila had accused Richard of domestic violence, and by May 1990, she hadn't been living with her husband, and a police reported that she'd been living in an apartment that they discovered was being paid for by Michael Warren. Law enforcement started their investigation into Sheila Keene just days after the murder. A witness came forward saying that approximately 6 p.m. on May 24th, just days before the shooting, a woman with long brown hair came in and purchased a clown costume from their costume shop on South Dixie Highway. The woman also purchased an orange wig, a sponge nose, and makeup. The store employees remembered the woman asking for extra white makeup to get complete face coverage. 2 of the shop employees would tentatively identify Sheila from photo lineup shown by the police. One of the 2 balloons found at the crime scene was discovered to be so unique they were only sold at one public store in town. An employee there said that 2 hours before the shooting, a woman with long brown hair had come in and purchased 2 Mylar balloons and a basket of flowers. Law enforcement were even able to connect her to the car that the clown had used. Sheila had been at Bargain Motors on April 14th when the car was dropped off. Police believed that Michael Warren and one of his employees may have been involved in stealing the car, but couldn't find any evidence to confirm this. The evidence law enforcement found in the vehicle were orange fibers similar to ones found in synthetic wigs, a brown hair that police said was consistent with the hair that they found in Sheila Keene's apartment, and a brown paper bag from Publix. Sheila denied having any involvement and said that she had not bought a clown costume or a basket of flowers or balloons. Her alibi was that she'd been out all day looking for cars to repossess and could not specify exactly where she'd been that day. It would seem like law enforcement had a growing amount of evidence, but a lot of it was circumstantial. They believed that Michael was involved but couldn't prove it, and his alibi made it impossible for him to have been the one that pulled the trigger, and the evidence against Sheila was piling up. At the time, prosecutors didn't feel that there was enough evidence to convict, and they would only get one shot, so they didn't make any arrests in 1990. Michael Warren also continued to be a suspect but was not charged with any crime connected to his wife's murder. However, during the investigation, law enforcement looked into every part of the Warren business and discovered Michael had been doing something illegal. He was charged with 43 counts of odometer tampering, grand theft, and racketeering. He went to prison in 1994 and spent 3 years there. His business and properties never recovered. And while in prison, he only had a few visitors: his mother, sister, grandmother, and a few friends from his horse racing days. Joey never visited. Michael Warren, in an interview right before he went to prison, speculated that he thought maybe his wife was a victim of an angry tenant or car buyer. Authorities didn't believe that she was a victim of any angry person involved with their businesses. Marlene's love for clowns had been well known. It had been a very personal attack and no one seemed to have a grudge against Marlene specifically. However, without new evidence, the case would go cold and Sheila Keene would go off the radar for now. Marlene's son Joe became estranged from his stepfather and reportedly moved back to Michigan to be close with his grandparents. He's also stated that he had spent a year grieving the loss of his mother, brother, and father with drugs and alcohol. He has since been able to pull himself out of the fog and he has often taken interviews and has been very open to talking with the media about the case for years. Joe has also always held the belief that Sheila Keene was responsible for his mother's death. More than a decade later, police would be shocked to discover that Michael Warren was now married to the lead suspect in his wife's murder. In 2002, Michael and Sheila married in a quiet Las Vegas wedding, and now she was Sheila Keene Warren. After their marriage, they moved to Tennessee and Sheila started going by the name Debbie. They purchased a fast food restaurant called the Purple Cow. An ex-employee said that one year Sheila had dressed up as a clown for Halloween at the restaurant, and when she was drunk, she had boasted about getting away with murder in Florida. They sold the restaurant in 2016, purchasing a property in Abington, Virginia, and retired. They were able to reopen the case and they were going back through the evidence that couldn't be used in 1990 with new DNA technology. Forensic experts were able to connect to the evidence. DNA from the hair in the getaway vehicle directly to Sheila Keene. As far as the new evidence was, the key pieces of evidence was hair found in the getaway vehicle and a hair that was found entangled in the balloon ribbons. Both were positively matched back to Sheila. Sheila Keene Warren was arrested in 2017 for the murder of Marlene Warren. She was charged with first-degree murder and the death penalty had originally been sought by the prosecution, but was later reduced. She would continue to deny her involvement for years. She pleaded not guilty at her first plea hearing and was held without bail while she awaited trial. Following her arrest, an employee's son came forward with an allegation. His father had reclaimed a deathbed confession for the purpose of being able to blackmail Michael of his involvement in helping Michael and Sheila cover up Marlene's murder, and he knew where the murder weapon was. A vehicle was found when law enforcement searched the canal where John Moran had said the car would be. The vehicle was searched, but nothing was found inside the vehicle that appeared to tie into the murder. Divers also searched for the gun, but it wasn't found. In 2017, Michael Warren, in an interview with the media, said that his now wife, Sheila Keene, had nothing to do with the death of his first wife and that Sheila was innocent. He's reported to be standing with his second wife and has continued to express his belief that she didn't kill Marlene Warren. There were multiple delays in getting a court date for Sheila. Many of the delays were due to COVID-19. Some delays were reported because of the difficulties with the evidence. Sheila Keene Warren, now 59 years old, was finally set to have her trial in May 2023. But in April 2023, just 2 weeks before her trial date was to start, she changed her previous plea of not guilty to guilty after a plea deal that allowed her to plead second-degree murder was brought forward by the prosecution. The plea deal was for 12 years and with time served, she'd be looking at the possibility of being released by 2025 since Sheila had been in custody since 2017. In 1990, second-degree murder sentences in the state of Florida could be drastically reduced with good behavior. Sheila has been reported to have been a model inmate since her arrest, so it is believed she will serve just over half of her sentence. Michael Warren does not seem to have spoken to the press since 2017. Now in his 70s, he seems to still reside in Virginia and live a quiet life. No evidence of a recent comment on the guilty plea could be found. Police always believed that Michael may have played some role in his wife's death, but there was never any evidence that connected him to the crime. He was never arrested or charged with any crimes related to Marlene's murder. Marlene's son Joe was at the sentencing hearing via video conferencing. It was reported that he told the judge that he accepted the plea conditions. What do you think of the outcome of this case? Do you think justice was served? Do you think Michael was involved? Let me know in the comments section down below. Greg Lawson, a Louisiana man who spent more than half his life on the run, has now been apprehended after 30 years on the FBI's most wanted list. 63-year-old Greg Lawson was located in Huatulco, Mexico, and was brought back to U.S. soil on September 19, 2023. Lawson had been in the middle of a trial for gunning down his childhood best friend, Seth Garlington, on April 24, 1990, when he just left the county courthouse before the jury had come back with their verdict. In 2007, the FBI announced a $10,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Greg Lawson, and 3 decades passed before a credible tip cashed in that reward. In coordination with law enforcement in Mexico, the FBI located Lawson, who had been using the identity of a deceased man from Alabama, and were able to swiftly arrest Lawson, and who apparently laughed as he was being cuffed. Once back in Louisiana, Lawson was charged with an additional felony for bail jumping, and he is being held at the Claiborne Parish Detention Center while he awaits further court proceedings. Douglas A. Williams Jr., special agent in charge of FBI New Orleans, said in a statement, quote, "We want to thank our partners and the public in this case who never gave up hope that justice could be served for Mr. Lawson's victim. There's no doubt that Mr. Lawson might still be in the wind if our partners in Mexico had not been willing to deal with this so swiftly." Maliko. On July 23, 2023, one of Canada's most wanted fugitives was located and arrested in a Detroit, Michigan suburb. In a coordinated arrest, Maliko was extradited back to Windsor, Ontario in connection to the 2022 drive-by shooting that killed 24-year-old Daniel Squalls. Maliko was a semi-professional basketball player who played in the junior teams but never made it to the NBA, unlike his brother Maurice Kalu. At the time of the murder, Malik was 26 years old. Kalu was on the run for 9 months. Video surveillance had placed him at the scene of the crime. Kalu had also been on release for another violent crime, which Windsor police have stated is another reason to keep violent offenders in custody while awaiting further court proceedings. He had been added to the Canadian Be on the Lookout or BOLO program's top 25 most wanted fugitives. In his time on the run, there had been a $6,000 reward for information leading to his arrest, and it is unclear if it was a tip that located him. Daniel Squall's mother, Tylena, said of the arrest, quote, "I shouted, I jumped, I cried. I'm just so excited now. Daniel's finally going to get some justice." It appears the shooting may have been prompted by a custody disagreement. Daniel Squall was with a woman and his daughter, and the woman also had a child with Kalu. The family had recently informed Kalu of their relocating to the U.S., but because of Kalu's criminal history, he wouldn't be able to see his child freely. The lead detective on the case, Staff Sergeant Joe Faddle, said in addition to the surveillance footage, there is forensic evidence that directly ties Kalu to the crime scene. He also stated that he may seek additional charges for anyone who aided Kalu while he was on the run. "There is no doubt in my mind that people have helped him evade capture for 9 months. This could not have been done by himself. We will continue this investigation into anybody who assists Mr. Kalu in any sort of way to avoid capture." The gun used in the murder was not found at the time of the arrest. Edgar Salvatore Cashin Garcia and Araceli Medina. For 2 years, 34-year-old Edgar Salvatore Cashin Garcia and 38-year-old Araceli Medina had been on the run after fleeing Washington state. The pair had been the first fugitive couple to appear on the U.S. Marshals Top 15 Most Wanted list. They were wanted for various crimes relating to child abuse allegations, and it sparked an international manhunt. Not just for them, but also for their 5 children. The children were considered endangered. The situation began to unfold in 2020 when 2 little girls were discovered abandoned at a gas station in Tijuana, Mexico. The girls, aged 8 and 3, were taken into child protective custody, but the girls were extremely traumatized. It took child welfare experts 6 months to get the girls to trust them enough to explain what had happened to them. The girls were sisters, and they had continually asked officials if they had found their 7-year-old brother. The eldest girl eventually revealed their names and the extensive amount of physical and sexual torture used by Edgar Salvatore Cashin Garcia and Araceli Medina. Until recently, the 3 children had lived with their maternal grandmother. It had been who the 3 kids had always lived with until May 2020 when Cashin Garcia and Medina took custody of the 3. From there, the girls described the absolute hell that they had been faced with when they lived with the pair. They described being trafficked out to strange people, abused, and just unimaginable horrors. Law enforcement in Washington located the couple and began to investigate. When officers arrived at the family's apartment, Cashin Garcia told law enforcement that their son, the boy that the 2 girls had been desperate for police to find, was staying with relatives in California. However, the boy was not found, and when law enforcement went back to arrest the couple, they discovered that they had fled to Mexico. At the time of their escape, Medina had visitation of her 4 children from another relationship and her infant son with Cashin Garcia. The couple were initially wanted on first-degree sexual assault and 3 counts of assault of a child. However, on February 5, 2022, hikers found the skeletal remains of 7-year-old Edgar Jr., the missing child. Another charge was added to the warrant, first-degree murder. Based on the evidence found on the remains and testimony from the other 2 girls, Edgar Jr. had been tortured to death and both physically and sexually abused by both Cashin Garcia and Medina, but also other individuals. Marshals elevated the fugitive investigation when Edgar Jr.'s remains were found, and there was a $20,000 cash reward for information leading to the couple's arrest. In February 2023, the reward was bumped up to $50,000, and it was only a few weeks later when law enforcement got a tip that would eventually lead to the couple's capture. On March 31, 2023, the couple were captured along with their 5 missing children. Detective John Davis of the Kennewick Police Department said of the situation, quote, "This is the worst child abuse case I've come across in 9 years as a detective. What we've seen from this investigation, Garcia and Medina had no problem hurting children to outright murder. The crimes that Araceli Medina and Edgar Cashin Garcia are charged with are heinous, and we commend the unwavering dedication of law enforcement. The successful rescue is a testament to the critical importance of collaboration and community involvement in safeguarding our most vulnerable population." The duo were extradited back to Washington, where they now face their charges. No word yet on further court proceedings. They're being held in custody while they await further court appearances. Their bail has been set to $5 million each. Michael Anthony Baltimore. It was in 2021 when Michael Anthony Baltimore was added to the U.S. Marshals Top 15 Most Wanted list. Baltimore had previously been on the reality TV show 90 Day Fiancé, in which he was featured working as a barber at the GQ Barbershop in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Even featured on the show were his co-workers and boss, longtime friend and mentor, Kendall Jerome Cook. After the show had aired, however, Baltimore and Cook had a falling out. And on May 22, 2021, Baltimore went into the barbershop and opened fire, killing Cook and injuring another employee at the shop. Baltimore then fled, and the surviving victim had been able to positively identify Baltimore as the shooter. Baltimore was wanted on charges of assault, homicide, and parole violations. He had an extensive criminal history that went back to the 90s, and while on the run was considered armed and dangerous. It was later announced that there was a $25,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, but it wasn't needed because 6 months after that announcement, Baltimore went into a restaurant in Davies, Florida, and started a physical altercation with another patron there. In the restaurant, an employee trying to break up the fight got hit in the face with the back of a knife, and the suspect fled, claiming to be retrieving a gun. It was then that law enforcement was called. Baltimore fled, but was later arrested on January 20, 2023. Upon his arrest, he was fingerprinted, and it was then that Davie police realized they had a wanted fugitive in their custody. Baltimore had attempted to give officers a fake name. Also in his possession were drugs, a handgun, and 3 fake IDs. Michael Anthony Baltimore is being held in Florida, where he faces charges there, and it's likely he will be extradited back to Pennsylvania to face the murder charge there as well. A war criminal wanted for his participation in the 1994 Rwandan genocide was recently discovered hiding in South Africa. Fulgence Kayishema had been on the run since 2001 when it was discovered that he had orchestrated the killing of more than 2,000 men, women, and children on April 15, 1994 at a church in Rwanda. An estimated 800,000 people were killed in 90 days in what is described as one of the most brutal genocides in human history. It was revealed that during the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwandans that Kayishema attempted to burn a church with 2,000 Tutsi people hiding inside. Failing to ignite the structure, he helped to use a bulldozer to collapse the building, killing all those who sought refuge inside. He was charged with genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, and crimes against humanity charges. However, when law enforcement went to arrest him, he had already fled. The United States government themselves had offered a $5 million reward for information leading to his arrest. For over 2 decades, multiple agencies worked tirelessly to find Kayishema, and it was while monitoring family members that they eventually had word that he was hiding in South Africa. Kayishema had been using a forged identity and was working on a grape farm in Cape Town. When he was discovered and arrested on May 19, 2023, he initially denied his identity but eventually said to arresting officers, "I've been waiting a long time to be arrested." Fulgence Kayishema was a fugitive for more than 20 years. His arrest ensures that he will finally face justice for his alleged crimes. IREM-CTE Chief Prosecutor Serge Bro-Mertz, who led the investigation, said in a statement to the media, quote, "Genocide is the most serious crime known to humankind. The international community has committed to ensuring that its perpetrators will be prosecuted and punished. This arrest is a tangible demonstration that this commitment does not fade and that justice will be done no matter how long it takes." Kayishema's arrest is the fifth in recent years of top officials. Agencies are still looking to arrest 3 more. Kayishema is being held in Cape Town custody while he awaits his trial and sentencing. He faces life in prison. Wendy Stevens. On March 21, 1984, the manager of the Little League baseball field in Buren, Washington, was stunned when his dog returned to him holding a human bone in his mouth. The area, which is now land utilized by the Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, received heavy foot traffic and was especially popular in the summer months. After wresting the bone from the dog's mouth, the manager ran to his office and contacted the Kings County Sheriff's Office. Within a matter of hours, the field was teeming with forensic scientists and other experts who were eager to locate the source of the remains. Their answers lay in a swampy area of the baseball field that sat at South 146th Street and 16th Avenue South. After a long day's work, investigators had managed to uncover most of the remains, which were in a skeletal state. At the autopsy, the medical examiner determined the remains belonged to a white female between the ages of 12 and 18 years old, most likely around 15 years old, who stood at 5 feet 2 inches to 5 feet 8 inches and was between 110 and 130 pounds. The medical examiner was also able to determine that the girl had previously healed a skull fracture and had likely been left-handed. While the remains were skeletal, investigators were still able to determine a cause of death: strangulation. The circumstances and the age of the victim immediately shocked the police and the greater community. There had been whisperings of a serial killer for many years, and this latest discovery only added fuel to the fire. The girl had been deceased for around a year, and the medical examiner and anthropologist believed she had lost her life sometime the summer before. One day after the skeletal remains of the girl were found, the Kings County Sheriff's Office found themselves setting up yet another crime scene. According to Seattle Times, whilst out with bloodhounds, the investigators came across the remains of another young woman who would eventually be identified as 18-year-old Cheryl Wims. The pattern was becoming too apparent to ignore, and the Kings County Sheriff's Office had yet another homicide to add to their ever-growing list. As reported by the Seattle Times, just 8 months before the bodies of Cheryl and the skeletal remains were found, the remains of 17-year-old Shonda Summers was discovered half a mile from the swampy baseball field. Cheryl Wims was identified within a matter of days, but the victim in the other case was not so lucky. Despite investigators spending months scouring missing persons reports, nothing ever came to light, and she was dubbed Jane Doe B10 or Bones 10. In 2001, the world was shocked as it watched as Gary Ridgway was arrested and eventually convicted in the Green River killings. Between 1982 and 1998, although it's possible he was active until his arrest, Ridgway is believed to have taken the lives of as many as 70 to 100 girls and young women. Ridgway was only convicted of killing 48 victims, but he is readily admitted to being responsible for many more. Ridgway was interviewed at length about the many crimes believed to have been committed by him, and within days, he had given up knowledge about Jane Doe B10. He told investigators that he remembered picking up a young white woman he believed to be in her 20s in Tequila, a suburb of Kings County, in the spring or summer of 1983. He went on to add that he picked her up near the Pacific Highway South and remembered her murder in detail as he, quote, wanted to make sure she was dead because he had attempted to kill another woman nearby, but she had escaped. Unfortunately, Ridgway was not able to give investigators a name. In the case of Jane Doe B10 was added to his ever-growing rap sheet. In 2020, the DNA Doe Project obtained bone fragments from Jane Doe B10 and sent them to a third-party lab, Astrea Forensics, for further test date. Astrea was able to create a family tree for Jane Doe B10, and after much searching, they came across the possible parents of the Jane Doe. By late 2020, Cecil Gasper of Denver, Colorado, received a knock at the door that she had never thought would come. Cecil agreed to submit a DNA test, and weeks later, she finally learned the long-awaited truth. In August 1983, Cecil's daughter, 14-year-old Wendy Stevens, disappeared from their Denver, Colorado home. Wendy was a bright and intelligent young woman, but in the summer of 1983, she had become rebellious and was hanging in the wrong crowds. She would run away from home for a few days at a time. But in August 1983 would be the last. Cecil tried to report her daughter missing but was brushed off each time. In a bizarre and painful twist, Cecil had submitted her DNA to an ancestry site in 2019 in a bid to find out what had become of her beloved daughter. According to the DNA Doe project, quote, early in 2019, one of Wendy's parents had taken a direct-to-consumer DNA test and uploaded the results to GEDmatch, hoping to learn the fate of their daughter. Unbeknownst to the parent, GEDmatch had changed the settings on that kit in May 2019 as part of their new policy regarding law enforcement access to matches. Because the parent's kit remained opted out when DNA Doe Project uploaded Wendy Stevens' data in September 2020, that important connecting lead was not immediately available to the team. There are still 2 unknown Ridgway victims. The last 2 unknown victims are called Jane Doe B. 17, who was found in 1986, and Jane Doe B. 10, who was found with the help of Ridgway in 2003. Authorities still hope to identify them. Authorities believe that there's still more victims out there, and we may never know the exact number Ridgway killed. Gary Ridgway is currently residing at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Because of his immunity deal and assisting law enforcement to find all of his victims, there will be no charges related to Wendy Stevens' case, but Gary Ridgway will never be free and he will die in prison. Sarah Tatum Abbott. On April 20, 1979, the New Haven Water Company of New Haven, Connecticut, received an unusual and rather morbid call. On the other end of the line was the West Haven Police Department requesting their presence near Route 34 on Derby Avenue. They were informed that skeletal remains had been located on the company's property and a full investigation would be taking place. Managers of the water company raced to the scene and provided investigators with everything they needed to carry out their investigation. When law enforcement arrived, they found partial skeletal remains that were somewhat scattered across the land. The remains were taken into the custody of the state's medical examiner who was tasked with identifying them. Due to the level of decomposition that had taken place, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact cause of death. And a postmortem index is not listed in contemporary reports. The medical examiner could discern that the remains belonged to a white female between the ages of 18 and 30 who stood around 5 feet 1 inch to 5 feet 3 inches. It was determined that the young woman may have had some sort of congenital condition where the lower part of her vertebra was missing and she may have suffered from arthritis. And it was also noted that the woman had been born without wisdom teeth. The only items found with the remains were a black lace bra and a Westclox brand folding travel alarm clock in a red case. Without the cause of death, investigators found the investigation difficult. Her identifying features didn't match any local missing persons cases and no one came forward to claim her remains. 2 years after the initial discovery was made, the woman's mandible or jaw was found in an undisclosed location. Due to the scarce details available, the case quickly went cold. An interest in the case didn't pick up again until 2022 when Michelle Clark, a meteorological death investigator, partnered with Othram Labs. Othram did what they do best and were able to obtain a DNA profile from the partial skeletal remains. From there, genealogists scoured records and created a possible family tree which led them to one outcome. 29-year-old Sarah or Sally Tatum Abbott of New Haven, Connecticut. Not much is known about Sally other than the fact that she was born on August 3, 1940 in Manhattan, New York. At some point in her life, Sarah moved from Manhattan to New Haven, Connecticut, and was last heard from in July of 1970. Sally had been divorced at the time of her disappearance. Her ex-husband hadn't been the one to report her missing. Her siblings had done that. Sally didn't have any children with her ex-husband, and it's unclear if he is a suspect at this time. Her cause of death remains unclear. In 44 years, her family did not once stop searching for her. Anyone with information on Zara's case is asked to contact the West Haven Police Department Investigative Services Division at 203-937-3905. Joseph Lee Munis. On October 29, 1993, two squirrel hunters making their way through a wooded area just off I-59 in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, close to the Mississippi border, made the discovery that would haunt them forever. As the hunters moved through the area, they came across skeletal remains of an adult male. Whilst the remains had been there for some time, the hunters recognized one thing for sure: a bullet lodged in the back of the skull. The hunters made their way to their vehicles and called the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office. Officers quickly made their way to the scene and began taking stock. They too noticed the unknown victim had been shot in the back of the head, and the remains had clearly been scavenged by animals, making the identification process all the more difficult. According to Othram Labs, who would consult on this case decades later, only the skull and partial skeleton were covered due to animal activity, along with a few other items of evidence. The St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office was not equipped to take on such a large case, and in November 1993, they made the decision to send the remains to the Louisiana State University FACES Division, or Forensic Anthropology and Computer Enhancement Services Lab in Baton Rouge. The LSU FACES team was able to undertake a much more detailed examination of the remains. They determined that they belonged to a white male around the ages of 25 up to 38, who stood at 5 feet 6 inches to 5 feet 8 inches. The man had amalgam fillings on at least 11 teeth and a myriad of other health problems. According to the Doe Network in Othram, the young man was possibly healing a broken right hip and showed signs of remodeling to his right femur and fibula, which may have affected his gait and caused hip and back pain. Investigators also found another contributing factor to the man's hypothesized back pain: Schmerl's depression or nodes on several of his vertebrae. Schmerl's nodes are defined as spinal disc herniations which cause soft tissue of the spinal discs to protrude upward or downward to the adjacent vertebra. This condition often goes unnoticed, however it has been known to cause lower back pain in some patients. These depressions paired with the man's existing injuries would have likely caused the man some level of discomfort. Also with the remains, investigators found a distinctive pair of glasses and remnants of blue Wrangler jeans and size 11 Nike Air running shoes. Despite all of the information that was readily available to them, the St. Tammany's Parish Sheriff's Office had a difficult time identifying the remains or who had killed him. For many years, the case fell silent, with the SDPSO occasionally performing DNA comparisons from time to time. In 2020, the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office partnered with Othram Labs to perform more in-depth testing. Within a matter of weeks, Othram was able to uncover a list of possible candidates. After further screening, they had potentially tracked down two siblings of the John Doe who lived in Florissant, Missouri and Burnsville, Minnesota. Going to Othram, these two siblings were asked to provide DNA tests and further information about their brother. A year later, in June 2023, Othram and the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office held a press conference in which they identified the St. Tammany John Doe as 21-year-old Joseph Lee Munis, originally from Burnsville, Minnesota. Joseph's siblings confirmed he had been living in Louisiana in 1993, and they had last heard from him sometime in 1993. At this time, additional details about the suspected killer have not been made public, but the coroner's office did say that they believe the person who killed Joseph has since passed. The investigation into Joseph's murder is currently ongoing, and anyone with information is asked to contact Detective Marco Dema of the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office. Katherine Parker Johnson on August 21, 2001, a construction worker and property developments in Redondo Beach, California would make a discovery that would shut down operations for the foreseeable future. The discovery was so gruesome and troubling that it would go on to haunt investigators for several decades. And it was only thanks to genetic genealogy and the kindness of strangers that this case was reopened. On the day of the discovery, construction workers were working on a site at 1600 Walcott Street in Redondo Beach. They were digging in the backyard of a private residence when they made a chilling discovery. Wrapped inside a plastic bag was a headless skeleton. Operations immediately ceased and the Redondo Beach Police Department were summoned to the scene. As the remains were skeletal and without a head, investigators knew they were faced with a near impossible task. The medical examiner charged with investigating the case found it almost impossible to determine a cause of death. The estimated postmortem index, or PMI, was said to have been anywhere from 1 to 26 years, meaning that the victim could have passed away any time between 1974 and 2001. An anthropologist was brought into the case, and in their initial report, they believed that the remains belonged to a white woman aged 20 to 50. No clothing or personal items were found with the skeleton, so it was hard to discern anything about the woman. Without a face or a skull, investigators were left unable to create an approximation sketch, significantly hindering their investigation. Eventually, the case went cold and wouldn't be picked up until 2019 when the Redondo Beach Police Department partnered with the DNA Doe Project, which mainly relies on donations to fund their research. In 2019, the DNA Doe Project began examining the Redondo Beach Jane Doe's DNA further and made a vital discovery. She was determined to be of sub-Saharan African descent, not Caucasian, as previously noted in 2001. This new information gave the Redondo police a new jumping-off point, and the DNA Doe Project began scouring family trees. Eventually, they came across two women who shared a biological relationship with a possible match. And after contacting the two women, they provided comparative DNA samples. The DNA Doe Project work continued. In June 2023, the DNA Doe Project and the RBPD announced that they had finally identified the Redondo Beach Jane Doe as 24-year-old Katherine Parker Johnson of Lenox, California. The two women who had been identified as possible matches were revealed to have been Katherine's daughter and Katherine's sister. According to her sister, she last heard from Katherine in May 1981, and the date of official last contact being listed as August 31, 1981. Katherine had not been reported missing, although it's not known whether this was due to the family failing to report her or the local police department's failure to make a report, as seen in so many missing persons cases. It has been noted that sometime in 1980 or 1981, Katherine left home in Tennessee, headed for Englewood, California, and ending up in Lenox. Shortly thereafter, all contact ceased. Trunk Lady Doe. It was a late afternoon on Halloween Day in 1969 when two young boys saw something unusual while playing in a field in St. Petersburg, Florida. The boys watched as two older men in a truck dumped a black steamer trunk in a wooded area of 34th Street South, close to what used to be the Oyster Bar and the conjoined parking lot. After the men got back into their vehicle and drove away, the boys flagged down two officers who were on their routine patrols. Intrigued, officers approached the trunk with caution, unaware of what they were about to discover. As the two opened the trunk, they were greeted with horrific sight. Inside the trunk lay a woman wrapped in a large plastic bag, naked aside from a bloodied pajama top. It was clear that the woman had suffered several blunt force traumas to the head, and a men's Western-style BLO tie was still wrapped tightly around her neck. Shocked at what they had discovered, the officers ran to their car and immediately called for backup. Within the hour, the once quiet and serene St. Petersburg countryside was swarming with police officers. The woman's body was transferred to the District 6 Medical Examiner's office, which determined she was white, 25 to 35 years old. 5 feet 9 inches, 130 pounds with brown or black hair and brown eyes. Mineral Examiner also determined that she'd given birth at least once in her life and suffered from gallbladder issues. The woman's teeth were also said to be distinctive, with a small partial upper plate and several teeth missing. A copy of the woman's dental impressions was circulated to dentists around the area, but no one recognized them. Likewise, no one in St. Petersburg recognized the woman when an approximation sketch was distributed to local news outlets. Once the initial buzz of the case died down, the mystery of the trunk lady eventually went cold. Investigators traced the trunk that she had been found in to the non-breakable trunk company. This vital piece of evidence yielded little clues, and the trunk lady was buried in an unmarked grave in St. Petersburg Memorial Park Cemetery. Every so often, investigators would pull her case file, hoping to uncover some new evidence. But the case inevitably sat cold. In 2010, with the passage of time and advancements in forensic science, the trunk lady was exhumed for further testing. Isotope testing revealed that the woman had likely hailed from the southeastern U.S. and was not a Florida native. Moreover, she had spent several years in northern U.S. before she'd been murdered. However, they were deemed too degraded. In an incredible stroke of luck, Detective Wally Polsky in the St. Petersburg Cold Case Unit found hair and skin samples that had been taken from the trunk lady's first autopsy in 1969. These samples had been perfectly preserved and were sent to Othram in Texas for genetic genealogy testing. Using these tests and records, Othram managed to trace the woman's family tree. And fortunately for them, a now-adult close relative was also searching for the same woman. In May 2023, Othram and the St. Petersburg Police Department held a press conference in which they announced the trunk lady had been identified as 41-year-old Sylvia June Atherton of Tucson, Arizona. It had been Sylvia's daughter, Cylin Gates, who had been searching for her mother and had been the one to put forward her DNA in hopes of finding some answers. Cylin had said that she had been 9 the last time she saw her mother. She stated that her father had custody over her and her 11-year-old brother and that she'd gone over to see her one day in Tucson, Arizona and discovered that her mother had moved, packing the home seemingly overnight and leaving suddenly. She had been told that her mother had moved with her new husband, Stuart Brown, along with her 5-year-old sister, Kimberly and Brown, and older sister, Donna Lindhest, and her brother-in-law and Donna's husband, David Lindhest. Donna was 20 years old and it was believed that she and David were relocating to Chicago. The couple also had a small child as well. It was unclear why the family had up and moved so suddenly. And after they left, no one heard from Sylvia again. Cylin recognized the trunk when shown evidence from her mother's case and said that her mother had used this as a TV stand and had been one of the items of furniture that had been taken when the family moved. According to reports, the cohort left Tucson for Chicago, Illinois, and Sylvia's movements thereafter remain unknown. It's also unclear if any of them had ever made it to Chicago because Cylin had believed that Donna and David had ended up in Florida. Stuart Brown passed away in 1999 in Las Vegas, Nevada, where he'd been living for decades. And according to records, he had never filed any documents saying that he'd ever been married or had children. Brown had never reported his wife or daughter missing. As of October 2023, Sylvia's case remains unsolved. However, Cylin is still hopeful of reunited with her sister, Kimberly, who would be around 60 years old today, or Donna, who, if she was still alive, would be in her 80s. Anyone with information is asked to contact Detective Wally Polsky. Woodland Jane Doe. On September 12, 1976, the serenity of Woodland, Baltimore was shattered by horrific discovery. On Dogwood Road, close to the Lorraine Park Cemetery, pedestrians going about their morning found the body of a young woman wrapped in a sheet. Shocked at what they discovered, they soon called the Baltimore County Police Department to the scene. When police arrived, they determined the young girl's head had been wrapped in 2 bandanas and a grass seed bag. It was evident to investigators that the young girl had been strangled to death, and the autopsy would later show seeds in her throat, which is believed to have contributed to her passing. The girl had also been sexually assaulted before being dumped near the cemetery. Her hands had been crudely tied behind her back with cloth and a rope. At the autopsy, the young woman's body revealed a frightening clue: chlorpromazine. This medication is sedative. At the time, it had been used to treat schizophrenia. According to reports, a large amount of the drug was found in her system, which signaled to police that she'd been drugged, assaulted, and strangled. Person responsible had likely given her the drug to subdue her before launching the attack. In the report, the medical examiner noted that the girl was likely between the ages of 15 and 30 years old, possibly white or Hispanic, with brown wavy hair and brown eyes. Despite the initial shock and outcry that the case garnered, no one stepped forward to identify her, leading investigators to call her the Woodland Jane Doe. In news reports, the police noted that the girl's teeth were in excellent condition and she also had a crudely done tattoo on her right arm. The tattoo was believed to have been the initials JP, JS, JD, JB, SPSS, SD, or SB. The seed sack that covered her head read Farm Bureau Grass Seed, Lexington, Massachusetts, and was traced back to a Buffalo, New York manufacturer. According to the manufacturer, this seed bag was only sold in 5 places across Massachusetts, considerably narrowing down the police's field of view. Despite having such a telling clue on their hands, investigators failed to learn anything more about their victim. In late 1976, the Woodland Jane Doe was laid to rest in an unmarked grave. Years would pass before the case would pick up speed again. In 2015, when investigators received information that pointed to the Woodland Jane Doe being of Puerto Rican or Colombian descent, the tipster claimed that they believed that Woodland Jane Doe had moved from either of these countries to Boston, Massachusetts, more specifically the area of Jamaica Plain. This clue tied into a crude tattoo found on the young woman, but that lead eventually fizzled out. In 2021, the Baltimore County Police Department announced that they were working with Othram Labs to uncover the mystery of Woodland Jane Doe once and for all. Using genetic genealogy and other forensic methods, Othram discovered that the body found in 1976 belonged to 16-year-old Margaret Fedoroff of Alexandria, Virginia. Her family last saw Margaret in Alexandria in mid-1975 before she vanished into thin air. A missing person report had been filed, but investigators in different counties and states had failed to connect the dots. Margaret's body was found just 53 miles away from where she disappeared a year after she'd been reported missing. There are some speculations that Margaret may have been taken from Alexandria and put into some sort of human trafficking operation, which may be the source of the tattoo. She had been alive for a year from the time she had disappeared until her murder. Her brother is asking anyone who knew Margaret to come forward with any information they may have. They are looking for anyone who knew Margaret in 1975 or anyone who met her while she had been missing. The question of who killed Margaret is still being explored. Adam Doe. This is kind of a connected update to a case we previously covered nearly 2 years ago. On October 18, 1983, a middle-aged couple was out gathering mushrooms in Lake Village, Indiana, when they came across an abandoned farm. There, they discovered several shallow graves that contained the bodies of 4 deceased young men who had been drugged and stabbed. As Michael Bauer and John Bartlett, but the identities of the 2 other men remained a mystery. They soon became known as Brad Doe and Adam Doe of the Newton County John Does. While it would take years for the John Does to be identified, it didn't take as long to identify their murderer, serial killer Larry Eyler, also known as the Highway Killer, when the 4 bodies on the farm had been discovered. Eyler died in prison in 1994 from an AIDS-related complication while on death row for the murders of 15-year-old Danny Bridges. A posthumous confession, it was revealed that Eyler had murdered at least 21 young men that he'd picked up hitchhiking. Years passed without any successful leads on either John Doe's identity. Then in 2021, after 37 years, the Newton County Coroner's Office was finally able to identify Brad Doe by his true name. John Ingram Brandenburg Jr. John had gone missing from Chicago, Illinois in 1983 and was 19 years old at the time of his death. The last time his family saw him, he was leaving their home to visit a friend. Now it was Adam Doe's turn to be identified. He was described as a young black male between 15 and 18 years old. He had died between 1982 and 1983. Using the same methods to identify John, experts turned to genetic genealogy, and the DNA Doe Project stepped in to help. In July 2023, Adam Doe was officially identified as 16-year-old Keith Lavelle Bibbs, who had been from Chicago originally. For Eyler's death, he had been able to recall several details about Keith's abduction, but not his identity. He said that he had picked up Keith, who had been hitchhiking outside Terre Haute, Indiana. The family has not revealed much information about Keith as they are extremely private, but they did allow Keith's remains to be returned to Chicago, where they held a funeral for him with the family and the investigations who'd worked his case over 4 decades. The Woodland Jane Doe. On October 26, 1978, the Pershing County Sheriff's Office in Nevada received a call to come out to the Scosa Road close to the town of Immel, Nevada. When law enforcement arrived, they were greeted by a grisly scene. The remains of a badly decomposed adult female had been discovered stuffed into a garment bag. After dumping her so callously, her killer had dug a shallow grave and left her there to be discovered. Her body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where they hoped that her bones would garner more information. The medical examiner determined that the remains belonged to a middle-aged woman with red or auburn hair and was 5 feet 5 inches. Due to the state of her remains, a cause of death could not be determined, and it was marked as a homicide due to the circumstances in which she was found. Investigators had one last hope: her clothing. She was found wearing a dark green 3/4 length jacket with a white metallic safety pin attached, dark green pants with a long pink heavy sweater with a short sleeve pullover type t-shirt, and cotton underwear. Unfortunately, the case quickly went cold. An crude reconstruction of her face had been made and circulated around the state. However, no one recognized her. As the years passed, technologies advanced. Investigators created a digital reconstruction of her face and submitted her dental records. Her records didn't match any known missing person, and investigators felt as though they were stuck in a limbo. Several decades would pass without a word in the Woodland Jane Doe case. That was until March 2022, when the Pershing County Sheriff's Office reached out to Othram Labs. The Woodland Jane Doe's remains were sent off to Othram for genetic genealogy testing, and within months they were able to find a match. In March 2023, Othram and the Parish and County Sheriff's Office held a joint press conference in which they identified the Woodland Jane Doe as Florence Charleston of Portland, Oregon. According to reports, Florence had spent most of her life in Cleveland, Ohio, and had moved to Portland shortly before she had died. Florence was in her late 60s, possibly around 68 when she died, and both investigators and her family remained baffled as to how she ended up in Nevada. As of November 2023, no suspects have been made public and Florence's case remains stone cold. Before we proceed, I've got an exciting surprise for you. We've launched a brand new channel dedicated to intriguing content such as old historical mysteries, cold cases, and particularly chilling horror stories perfect for bedtime. Drop a comment letting us know if you're a fan of horror stories or not. You can find the link in the description below. Let's find out who will be the first to explore it. Alright, let's dive back into the video. Paisley Schultz. It was on July 13, 2019 in Cayuga Heights, a small community located on the outskirts of Ithaca, New York, when a custody battle turned heated. At the center were 4-year-old Paisley Schultz and her older sister, who was already school age. The older sister was picked up from school by her maternal grandmother and aided by a social worker and police escort. They headed over to the biological parents' home to get Paisley. But when they arrived, the home was empty. The parents, Kimberly Cooper and Kirk D. Schultz Jr., had long since been believed to be the abductors of Paisley, and several properties were searched, but no sign of the child was found. They had lost their custody battle when a babysitter came forward with some concerns about the children's well-being in the home. Kirk Schultz was later arrested and charged with possession of methamphetamines and heroin. Prior to the abduction, Cooper and Schultz had already lost 2 daughters in infancy prior to Paisley's birth. However, their causes of death are unknown, though it is speculated that this has also contributed to them losing custody. The babysitter also alleged the girls were often taken with their parents to work to dangerous job sites. They owned Schultz Pavane, and if they couldn't afford childcare, they just brought the girls with them, often as late as midnight and without supervision. She also alleged that both parents used illicit substances while caring for the girls on the job, operating machinery, and while driving. Law enforcement repeatedly questioned Schultz Jr. and his father, and both had been adamant that they didn't know where Kimberly was and that they believed she had taken Paisley to Philadelphia. Officers had been allowed voluntary entry to the homes nearly 24 times, but they weren't allowed access to search the basement or the bedrooms. No sign of Kimberly Cooper or Paisley was seen over the next 24 months, and until new evidence was brought forward, law enforcement had their hands tied. On Valentine's Day in 2022, an anonymous tip was called in and reported a sighting of Kimberly Cooper, and she was at the home of her father-in-law. Law enforcement secured a search warrant for the whole property and descended. Officers had been searching for an hour when one detective noticed something not feeling right about a staircase that descended to the basement of the home. He inspected further and noticed that the stairs had a small crack that revealed something inside, and using a flashlight, he saw what appeared to be little feet underneath. The floor was ripped open and revealed a small makeshift opening dug into the foundation of the home. The room had a dirt floor, was wet, and smelled of mold and human waste, and a pile of filthy soaked blankets was Kimberly Cooper holding her now 6-year-old Paisley Schultz. Kimberly Cooper, Schultz Jr. and Sr. were taken into custody and charged with felony custodial interference in the 1st degree and a misdemeanor endangering the welfare of a child. Cooper also faced additional felony charges related to the abduction. All have pleaded not guilty. Paisley was taken to the hospital where it was said that she was deemed healthy and returned to the care of her maternal grandmother and older sister. Experts have said there is still a long road ahead for Paisley's journey. She hasn't been to school, she is quite behind in terms of learning, and has had a very limited experience from being confined to one house for so long. It isn't believed that Paisley was confined to under the stairs, and she did have her own bedroom within the home. The under the stairs was simply used as a stowaway area to wait out whenever law enforcement came to the property. Law enforcement said on the matter, quote, "I understand as a parent no one wants to lose custody of their children, but sometimes the right thing for us to do for our children is the hardest thing to do for our children. What they should have done in 2019 when custody was granted to a third party, they should have relinquished the child rather than run and hide." Kayla Unbehaun. An episode of Netflix's Unsolved Mystery was the reason that now 15-year-old Kayla Unbehaun was reunited with her father after being abducted in 2017 by her mother, Heather Unbehaun. Back on July 5, 2017, the then 9-year-old was abducted from South Allegan, Illinois after a scheduled visit with her mom. Heather didn't have full custody of Kayla and had been during one of her weekly visitations that she fled with Kayla. Heather had told friends that she had a camping trip planned with Kayla, and neighbors recalled seeing her packing her vehicle with a bunch of things. When Kayla's father, Ryan Azurka, went to pick her up, the duo was no longer there. Heather had expressed a desire to live off the grid and had already been in violation of their custody agreement when she took Kayla out of state without the court's permission. A felony kidnapping warrant was issued for the pair, as well as Heather's car, but they weren't immediately located. Heather's phone and all of her social media had been deactivated, and it seemed as though it had been a well-thought-out abduction. For 6 years, Ryan Azurka worked tirelessly to find his daughter. Her cold case was briefly featured on Unsolved Mysteries in an episode dedicated to parental kidnapping cold cases. Her picture had been only on the screen for 4 seconds, but it was enough for a local store owner to recognize the now teenager. While at a shopping mall in Asheville, North Carolina on May 13, 2023, Heather and Kayla were approached by mall security. When law enforcement arrived, the pair gave false names. The pair were detained until they were able to positively identify the pair. Heather's been held in custody on a $250,000 bond, and Kayla was reunited with her father. Ryan Azurka made this emotional statement to the media, quote, "I want to thank the South Elgin Police Department, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, and all of the law enforcement agencies who assisted with her case. I also want to thank all of the followers on the Bring Kayla Home Facebook page who helped keep her story alive and were instrumental in spreading awareness. We ask for privacy as we get to know each other again and navigate this new beginning." Heather Unbehaun is being extradited to Illinois, where she is expected to be charged with felony child abduction. Richard Wayne Landers. Richard Wayne Landers Jr. was only 5 years old when he was abducted in 1994 from Wolcottville, Indiana by his paternal grandparents. Landers Jr. appeared to have always lived with his grandparents along with his parents, but when the two had split up, Landers Jr. was the subject of a long and bitter custody battle. Ultimately, temporary full custody was awarded to his mother, Lisa Harder. There are reports that Harder had been homeless, but at the time of the final custody hearing, she had secured an apartment and was equipped to take custody and care of her son. However, the grandparents disagreed, and the morning they had been mandated to hand over Landers Jr., they took off. For 2 decades, the case sat cold, with neither Richard Landers Sr. nor Harder having contact with their son. The grandparents Richard and Ruth Landers had a warrant out for their arrest but they weren't heard from for years. And over the years, his parents never gave up hope on finding their son. His pictures were sent out locally and nationally multiple times throughout the years, and charges against the grandparents were elevated. On the 20th anniversary of the abduction, the cold case was reopened and law enforcement obtained Richard's social security card. It was discovered that a man in Minnesota was using the same number with a different name, but the same age and birthday. Only weeks after the anniversary, a 24-year-old man was identified as Richard Landers Jr., now married with children of his own. The grandparents were also found living in Browardville, Minnesota, and had been living under assumed names. Upon their arrest, they confessed to being Richard and Ruth Lander. It appears that Landers Jr. was, or at least is now, fully aware of the situation and has forgiven his grandparents. He believes that they had the best intentions for him and believed that they did the right thing for him. The grandparents were not charged, as the original charges were dropped in 2008. The community that the three had settled in were shocked by the news and stated that the family had kept to themselves mostly and were quiet. Both of the parents of Landers Jr. have made contact with their son and are working towards moving forward with cultivating a relationship. The father has told the media that he forgives his parents and is just grateful his son is alive and well, and he still has an opportunity to get to know him. Sabrina Allen. It was in 2002 when Greg Allen's life changed forever. On the trail of what had been a messy divorce and even messier custody battle for his 4-year-old daughter Sabrina, things had just started to look up. Greg, an engineering scientist, had been granted primary custody, and after months of fighting with his ex-wife, Dara, things had just started to get easier. They were falling into a good routine, and the parents were beginning the road to cooperative co-parenting. Greg brought Sabrina to her mom on April 19, 2002 for the weekend. It had been agreed upon that Dara would return Sabrina on Sunday evening, but she never showed up. Greg recalled the last goodbye before the drop-off, and Sabrina had looked up at him and said, "Daddy, don't ever forget me." At the time, he thought it had been a silly little exchange, but it turned into an almost sinister warning. In the early stages of the divorce, Dara had often threatened to take Sabrina away. Dara was from Mexico and had wanted to return there with Sabrina since the beginning of their divorce. When Greg was granted primary custody, the courts had agreed that Sabrina would stay in Texas. There had been several wild attempts during the divorce to convince the little girl to lie in order to be granted protective orders from Greg. Sabrina had even been taken from school once by Child Protective Services when she allegedly told a social worker, "My daddy hits my mommy." "That's a lie my mommy told me to say." Greg called the police 2 hours after the time of drop-off had passed. He'd made several attempts to reach Dara, but all efforts went to voicemail. But by then it was too late, and Dara and Sabrina were long gone. In addition to the police and Texas Rangers, Greg also hired a private detective. They tracked their whereabouts to the Texas-Mexican border, and they were able to confirm that Dara and Sabrina had purchased bus tickets to Mexico. Greg alerted all of the missing children's agencies and started his own website to generate tips. He also took a leave of absence from his job and went to Mexico City, where he tried to search for his daughter himself. Greg quickly learned that his lack of Spanish skills was holding him back, so he enrolled in an immersive Spanish class to learn the language as quickly as possible. Greg had been in Mexico for almost a year when he got his first solid tip. A teacher reached out to him and said that she had met a student who she believed was his daughter. She was blonde, the same age, and didn't speak much Spanish. She had been called Blanca because of her fair hair, and the teacher said that Blanca had been extremely distressed. She would get upset because she didn't understand the other children and begged the teacher to help her find her daddy in Texas. Only then did the teacher look online and see Greg's website. She had looked Greg up and was shocked to discover that Greg was only 30 minutes away from his daughter. Greg brought the information to the U.S. police and officers in Mexico, but because of the need to coordinate by the time both agencies worked out a game plan, Dara had taken Sabrina out of the school and relocated. Greg was devastated but continued the search for his daughter. He stayed in Mexico, took every opportunity to get his case in the media, and offered a $20,000 reward for information. Greg eventually remarried. He had fallen in love with the woman teaching him Spanish, and the couple married after 3 years. They now have 3 children together. 12 years after his daughter had been kidnapped, there was a new tip brought in from one of the private investigators Greg had hired. They located Dara in a small town outside Mexico City. They staked at the apartment for 2 weeks until they confirmed what appeared to be a teenage girl in the apartment. She had dark hair and was now 17 but showed no signs of physical harm. This time, officers moved quickly. They arrested Dara and had Sabrina. She was put on a plane and sent back to the U.S. Sabrina had not gone to school since 2003. Had her blonde hair dyed dark to conceal her identity and had not been allowed to leave the apartment for fear of being recognized. Dara had undergone several operations to also change her appearance. Sabrina was not immediately released to Gregan's family. She underwent extensive therapy to work through the many traumas she'd experienced for the last 12 years. She'd been confused and frightened about the relocation, and the years of hearing bad things about her father made her not want to see Greg. In fact, she'd been told he had committed suicide and abandoned her. Eventually, with family trauma counseling, they were able to rekindle their relationship, and Sabrina moved into Greg's home that she shared with his wife, Mariana, and their children. Dara was extradited back to the U.S., where a judge sentenced her to 6 years in prison for aggravated kidnapping and interfering with child custody. Dara's sister also testified against her sister, citing strange, unhinged behavior such as writing to their elderly mother pretending to be their deceased father. Greg said in a statement, quote, "Sorry for all the silence, but we have been necessarily focused on healing. The past year has been quite a roller coaster ride, but I like to think that we are past the hardest parts. I'm happy to report that I have a strong and growing relationship with my daughter, and we still have trials ahead, but we are doing well." Cathy Sposo? After nearly 4 decades, the killer of college student Cathy Sposo has been identified. 23-year-old Cathy Sposo had been hiking on the Thumb Butte Trail in Prescott, Arizona on June 13, 1987. It had been early in the day, but the sun had been well up. Cathy had only just left the trailhead when she was viciously attacked. This was a very popular hiking trail and multiple people had heard her screaming, but no one could find her until it was too late. Cathy had been found in a brutal overkilling. She had been hit in the head with a rock, which might have been an attempt to immobilize her. She had also been beaten with a ratchet that had been left behind by the killer, shot in the face, and stabbed. It had been a brazen attack. There were people around, it was daylight, and Cathy had fought back with every ounce of strength she had. People were responding to her screams and trying to find her. Years later, another woman was attacked in almost identical circumstances. This woman had been camping nearby and had decided to hike the nearby trail. She had only started the hike when she was attacked by a man with a rock in his hand. She had been sexually assaulted but survived the attack. The time of day, location, and date had been too much to have been a coincidence. The DNA evidence was catalogued, but at that time nothing had come up, and again the case went cold. The difference was that she had frozen and complied with her attacker's demands. Once his attack was over, he ran off into the woods. For decades, Cathy's murder would stump law enforcement. Eventually, her case was handed off to a volunteer cold case unit who worked the case for 12 years. And over the years, the case was reopened, opened, examined, re-examined by new detectives. Even decades later, tips still poured in regarding the young woman who had been killed on the Thumb Up Trail. Cathy was remembered as a vibrant young woman taken too soon. While attending Prescott College, she worked as a waitress and she'd moved from Brooklyn, New York 2 years prior. Attention in the case was focused on the ratchet that had been used to bludgeon Cathy, as it had not just her DNA on it, but also that of her killer. His blood was able to be isolated and it held the key to discovering who he was. Law enforcement set the DNA off to pair up on nanolabs who were able to locate a female would narrow down the suspects down to 2 brothers, Scott and Brian Bennett. Scott was able to be eliminated, but his older brother Brian became the primary suspect. Brian, for some reason, went by his younger brother's name and had been relocated to Prescott a year prior to Cathy's murder. He'd originally been from Kentucky. He'd been 16 years old and a high school student when Cathy Sposo had been murdered and had not been any kind of suspect at that time. Brian would go on to have a history of violence towards women, and after Cathy's murder he had been accused of sexual assault of 2 women. In 1994, he killed himself with the same caliber of weapon that Cathy had been shot with, .22 caliber pistol. Law enforcement exhumed his body and they were able to get a positive match to Cathy Sposo's murderer, as well as a sexual assault that happened years later. The announcement was made on August 25, 2023. Cathy's parents had passed by that time, but her brother was able to receive the news that Cathy's murder investigation was solved after 36 years. Bennett's DNA has now been added to Cody's, and law enforcement will be looking to see if there's any additional victims out there. They feel it is unlikely that Cathy was the only murder victim. Evelyn Cologne. On December 20, 1976, passers-by making their way along Interstate Road 80 near the Lehigh River in Carbon County, Pennsylvania, made a harrowing discovery. Underneath the bridge lay 3 suitcases that had been thrown from the bridge above. When people drew closer, the familiar stench of decomposition permeated their nostrils and they flagged down the nearest police officer. When officers opened the 3 suitcases, they recoiled in horror inside of the remains of a young woman who had been shot, strangled, and dismembered and dumped into 3 suitcases. Her body had been heavily mutilated and the scene was too much for even the most seasoned officer to bear. Heartbreakingly, there wasn't just 1 body found in the suitcase, but 2. The body of an unborn baby girl, believed to be at 9 months gestation, was also found. Woman had also suffered sexual trauma before her life was taken. Investigators determined that the baby had been removed before the body was sawn into 10 pieces. On the left hand of the remains were the letters WSR with a 4 or a 5 written in pen, with a 7 or 4 underneath the right-hand side. The significance of these letters and numbers remains unknown to this day. The brutality to which this woman had been subjected to made investigators' stomachs turn. Whoever had done this to her had removed her ears, nose, and breasts in a bid to slow down the identification process. This level of brutality signaled to investigators that whoever was responsible likely knew the victim and was extremely angry with them. The case garnered statewide attention as residents were horrified to learn what had happened in their quiet community. Despite garnering wide-scale attention, no one recognized her. In the absence of a name, the woman's dubbed Beth Doe, and she and her unknown baby were buried in Pennsylvania. As the years passed, investigators continued to keep her case alive, but without any leads, it proved difficult. And with the advent of the internet, Beth Doe's case was picked up more than once thanks to internet sleuths. In 2020, the Pennsylvania Police Department partnered with Othram Labs to perform forensic genetic genealogy on Beth Doe's remains. Beth's femur was sent to Othram, who were successful in extracting a DNA profile. From there, Othram worked with another genetic genealogy company that discovered a possible relative. This relative was contacted, and after raising the necessary funds, they submitted a DNA sample. By February 2021, all agencies involved had completed their work and they were able to hold a press conference. They announced that Beth Doe was Evelyn Cologne, who was 15 years old when she disappeared from Jersey City, New Jersey. In 1976, Evelyn was living with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Louis Sierra, and was in the final stages of her pregnancy. Louis was known to be abusive towards Evelyn, and her family urged her to leave him. Her family wasn't particularly fond of Louis, who had previously been a neighbor to the Cologne family but allowed Evelyn to move in with him due to the pregnancy. According to reports, Evelyn disappeared sometime in December of 1976. That December, Evelyn's mother arrived at her apartment to deliver her some homemade soup, but when she arrived, she found the apartment empty. Both Evelyn and Louis were gone. In early 1977, Evelyn's family received a bizarre letter written in Spanish, supposedly from Evelyn. In the letter, she had said that she and the baby were okay and living happily. There was just one problem here. According to the Daily Mail, who spoke to Evelyn's parents, she couldn't write in Spanish. Her family desperately tried to find Evelyn over the years, hoping she would reemerge after leaving. But she never came home. Louis was, of course, the police's primary suspect. And in March 2021, a year after she was identified, he was arrested and charged with 2 counts of homicide. Louis is now 63 years old and had lived in Ozone Park, New York for many years. Investigators believe that he didn't want the child and took matters into his own hands. The case is currently ongoing. Evelyn's surviving family members were shocked at the identification. They had never believed anything nefarious had ever happened to Evelyn and that she was just out living her life somewhere. In a statement to the media, her nephew said, quote, "I wanted to find her, but not find her deceased. It was obvious there was no other person in the family who was missing, and that's when the ball started rolling. We're so thankful for that community, that Carbon County community, that they loved her, that they cared for her. They treated her like their own. These random people for all these years." Deborah Cerb. On New Year's Day 1974, Mr. and Mrs. Cerb returned to their Fresno, California home after a weekend away in Pismo Beach. They left their daughter home alone. When they returned, they found the body of their 17-year-old daughter Deborah Cerb in her room. She was found on the floor of her room in a nightgown and a robe. She had been strangled to the leotard that had been in her room. Her mother told law enforcement that she had talked to her daughter on the phone Saturday night, and everything had been fine. Deborah was a Fresno high school student. Her boyfriend, Tim Robinson, also a Fresno high school student, told law enforcement that he and Deborah had gone to a New Year's Eve party and that he dropped her off at home around 1 a.m. Tuesday, the 1st of January. There was no sign of forced entry at the home. Authorities believed that she had been getting ready for bed when maybe someone came to the door using that to get into the house. A sexual assault kit was done and the samples taken and preserved. Early reports had said that it was inconclusive if she'd been sexually assaulted, but more recent reports state that they believed that she had been. Authorities apparently had a person of interest who attended the New Year's Eve party with the couple, 17-year-old James Blaylock. Unfortunately, at the time, there was not enough evidence to charge Blaylock at that time. The case went cold. However, in 2006, the sexual assault kit was tested and returned with a match. James Blaylock, now in prison, was interviewed and denied any involvement with Deborah. When shown the DNA evidence, he changed his tune to say that they had consensual sexual encounter and that he had believed that she was alive. The district attorney filed the case, but it was dismissed due to lack of evidence. In 2021, detectives asked that the leotard that had been used as the murder weapon be tested, with more advanced DNA techniques. It came back with a positive match to James Blaylock. When detectives investigated further into the charges, they discovered that Blaylock, who was 66, had died in hospital in 2022. This has closed the case of Deborah Cerb. Her parents are deceased and never got to know who killed their daughter. James Blaylock had an extensive criminal record, which had included being a registered sex offender. Pearl Davis and Christina King. The Kansas City Police Department established its first dedicated cold case unit and has already solved 4 cold cases. One of these cases has been the murder of Pearl Davis and Christina King. The 2 women's cases were connected with DNA evidence, but at the time, the perpetrator was unknown to law enforcement. Pearl Davis's murder had occurred in 1996, and there's very little information available on her case. On November 22, 1996, Pearl was discovered murdered inside a home in Kansas City, Kansas. Her cause of death has not been revealed, and the only information available is that it was strongly believed that she didn't know her killer. Christina King's body was discovered in an abandoned building on Christmas Day in 1998. There were reports that Christina had been beaten to death. At the time of the murders, the cases weren't connected. But when the cold case unit was established, detectives discovered that DNA evidence had tied them together. Soon after, they were able to identify the source of that DNA as 52-year-old Gary Dion Davis. Senior Davis was a cross-country truck driver at the time of the murders. His DNA is being submitted to other states as law enforcement believe he is likely to have other victims out there. Davis has been charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder and is being held in custody on a $500,000 bond. His trial will commence in the new year. He faces life in prison if convicted of either murder. Family members of both Pearl and Christina attended the press conference but didn't speak. Both victims left behind an extensive family who have been shocked by the recent arrest. Susan Marsha Rose. The conclusion of this case is a little more unique. It wasn't genetic genealogy, there was no sting operation, and in fact, this case had very little hope of ever being solved. However, sometimes these things just happen. But on a random August evening, the now 68-year-old John Michael Ermer walked into the Portland, Oregon FBI office and confessed to the 1979 murder of Susan Marsha Rose in Boston, Massachusetts. Susan had been 24 years old at the time of the murder and had met Ermer while at a bar with friends. It had been Halloween night and he had offered to walk her home. While the two had walked into her building, the apartment on the first floor was being renovated, and it was then that Ermer grabbed a hammer and hit the woman on the head. Susan had been found the following morning. Her cause of death had been blunt force trauma. She had been sexually assaulted. There had never been a solid suspect in her murder. Ermer said that the following morning he left Boston and moved to New York. Susan had been from a small community in Pennsylvania and had been at her family's insistence that she should go out and see more of the country. It had been her coworkers that had to identify her body. Following the confession, Ermer's DNA was collected and tested against evidence in Susan's case, and it was determined to be a match. Ermer had already been imprisoned for another murder. He'd been in prison for 30 years for that killing, and he also confessed to another slaying in the southern U.S., but law enforcement has not been able to identify that victim. At this time, it's unclear what prompted the confession, but without it, he likely would have gotten away with murder. Ermer's being held in prison while he waits further court proceedings. He's been charged with murder and aggravated sexual assault. Since he's fully cooperating with law enforcement, it will likely be that there won't be a trial since he isn't fighting the charges. His next court appearance is unknown. Bryant Rivera appeared to be living a normal life. His parents, both with severe medical issues, relied on him heavily to maintain their independence. Those closest to him had no idea he was alleged to have been living a sinister second life. The 30-year-old now is being called in the media the Ted Bundy copycat. Bryant Rivera is being accused of multiple horrific murders in Mexico. Between 2021 and 2022, there are 3 women who've been able to be connected back to him, and all 3 women turned up dead. Let's get into it. It was on the morning of July 6, 2023 in Downey, California, when local and federal authorities arrested a man from the home he shared with his senior parents. Bryant Rivera was not being accused in California, but he was being charged with a crime in Mexico. He's being accused of femicide in Mexico. While not a common term in North America, femicide is recognized internationally by the United Nations as the most extreme forms of violence and discrimination against women and girls. Its definition varies across disciplines and world regions, but broadly captures the killing of women, primarily by men because they are female. And in Mexico, it's considered a hate crime and is prosecuted as a hate crime. There's not much released about his life before being in the media for the killings, and he's reported to have lived with his parents, Candido, and his mother Maria. His legal team have requested for him to be released on bail while he waits trial based on the fact that he is the sole caregiver for his parents who suffer from health issues including diabetes. His father is also blind and spends most of his time confined to a wheelchair, but at the time of his arrest, he was working as a delivery driver. His parents only speak Spanish and can't read English. Rivera has had no prior arrests or warrants in his name before his arrest. Reports have also stated that things in Rivera's household may not be healthy. Some media has gone on to say that Bryant was sharing a bed with his mother. After his arrest, his parents have said that they believe that their son is innocent. In an interview with the media, his father said that they would have to wait to see the evidence before coming to a conclusion of his guilt or innocence. Other reports have said that they will stand behind their son no matter what and that they believe that he has had nothing to do with these crimes. They stand behind their son and his parents depend on him. His sister has also spoken out saying that Rivera is very needed by his family and that the crimes he is accused of, quote, do not resemble the character of the boy that I grew up with. Would have never thought that he would, commit a crime of any sort. He's pretty much a nice guy. Like you would never think that he's a reserved, quiet person. And she has continued to advocate for her brother in the press. However, those who aren't in the family but are close to Bryant aren't surprised by his arrest. He was described by one friend that there had always been something off about him, but it was something that she couldn't pinpoint specifically. So what are the crimes he's being accused of? Authorities had already been looking for a serial predator as early as 2022, but they didn't have a solid lead until the murder of Angela Acosta Flores. Angela was a 20-year-old who had started dancing in September 2021 at the Hong Kong Gentlemen's Club in Zania Norte. Zania Norte is a legal red light district in Tijuana, Mexico, and it is believed to be one of the largest in North America. Sex work is legally federally in Mexico, and Zona Norte is one of the legal places for sex work. They require workers to have permits and regular health checkups to keep working. On the night of January 24, 2022, Angela's mother last saw her at approximately 8 p.m. when Angela had headed out to work at the club. She was an exotic dancer and occasionally also did sex work. She started her shift dancing when she met a man who called himself Eduardo, and he had asked for her to go back to his hotel room with him. She left with the man, letting her manager know where she was going. She texted her mother at 10:15 p.m. saying that she was going to the hotel nearby, Hotel Cascadas, with a client and that they would be in room 404. We could only guess that this was a safety measure put in place for when she left the property with a client. At 10:45 p.m., her mother texted her with no reply. She tried a second time at 11:15 p.m. with no answer from Angela. Her phone would continue to go unanswered and her mother started to worry. So she went down to the bar to investigate. She talked to a manager who said that Angela was probably still busy. Angela's boyfriend would get involved around 3 a.m. when he also went to the club. One of the bar staff told him that Angela had left with the gringo, who was about 5 feet 5 inches tall with a light brown complexion with a face full of acne scarring. They also knew him as Bryant Rivera from his credit cards and stated that neither had returned after they had left. The mother and boyfriend then went to the hotel and they both felt that Angela was in danger and that she probably needed immediate help. The hotel staff, however, would not let them in the room to investigate, so they waited until noon the following day. Then when an ambulance was called by hotel staff, a woman's body had been found. Her mother would use the Find My Phone app to track Angela's phone, and shockingly, the last ping for the phone was in Riverside, California. By the time Angela had been found, Bryant had already gone back to the U.S., crossing into the San Isidro point of entry just after midnight. The hotel was less than 3 miles from the border entry, so a 9-minute Uber or 30-minute walk. Angela's mother would have to identify her on February 2, 2022. Angela was found naked in the room and she'd been strangled and beaten to death. That showed Angela entering the hotel with a man just shortly after 10 p.m. Once they entered the elevators, Angela was never seen on the cameras again. Authorities found the name attached to room 404 was a man named Eduardo, the same name that he had used with the dancers at the Hong Kong Gentlemen's Club. Mexican authorities would later believe that this man was Bryant Rivera. The same man could be seen leaving the hotel an hour and a half after arriving with Angela, but this time he left alone. Tijuana is right next to the California border, and it would have been easy for him to get to the crossing in such a short time. Authorities believe that he must have taken Angela's phone with him, which would explain why the mother detected her phone over the border. No report has come out on whether the FBI or other officials have recovered her cell phone. The investigation would find similarities to a victim that was found in a dumpster in September 2021, but not many other details of that victim, including a name, have been released. She's been reported to have worked at the Hong Kong Gentlemen's Club for a short time, and Rivera may have been a client of hers, or she may have had a date with him in August 2021. It is believed that Rivera returned to Mexico in February 2022 and committed another murder. This time, a woman named Elizabeth Martinez Figueroa, a 25-year-old exotic dancer and sex worker who was also said to have worked at the Hong Kong Gentlemen's Club and has reportedly been on a date with an American on Valentine's Day. Police believe Rivera is this American man. Elizabeth was found in the back of her Jeep on February 17, 2022. She'd been strangled and beaten in a very similar way to the other victims. It is unknown when precisely the Mexican authorities discovered that Rivera may have been involved and that he lived in California. But his arrest warrant in Mexico was issued in November 2022, and January 2023 was the first time it was asked for by Mexican authorities to look for the man in California. Before Rivera was identified as a suspect, Mexican authorities in a press interview labeled this killer as a serial killer similar to Ted Bundy, who kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered dozens of young women and girls. He was active in the 1970s with 20 confirmed killings. After years, he confessed to 30 killings before he was executed by the electric chair in 1989. His exact number of murders is still unknown. A fourth victim is also now being investigated to be connected to Rivera. The Mexican authorities have only said that they are now investigating fourth victim and that there could be potentially many other victims with a similar cause of death. All the women were exotic dancers who worked as sex workers in the red light district. They were all strangled and beaten and had sexual intercourse shortly before their death. Up until this point, there had never been any reports that any of the women were sexually assaulted. American authorities have also revealed that they did find evidence in the home of Rivera when he was arrested, including a hotel receipt that matched the hotel and time that one of the victims was killed. In July 2023, Rivera's lawyers filed an opposition to the request for detention. After Rivera's defense lawyer had filed and asked for conditional release based on his parents' needs for help due to medical reasons, a judge ruled that Bryant Rivera would be held without until his extradition hearing. Extradition can take months if not years for the process to move forward. Extradition can only happen if one country has an extradition treaty with the other country and that country has to sign a petition for the extradition of that person who is accused of crime and would like them to face charges in their country. There are extensive requirements from both sides to have been met before a person can be released to the requesting country, and oftentimes you kind of see a give and a take. If he is deported to Mexico, Rivera will face charges of femicide, which has a sentence of 65 years for each victim if convicted. He is and is still currently only charged with the death of Angela Acosta Flores, and Mexican authorities have said they are working on charging Rivera with more crimes. The media and authorities describe Bryant as a serial killer who cares very little for women, that he hates and targets sex workers, and he kills with fury, beating and then strangling his victims. This is only the beginning, and there may be more victims that are connected to this killer. And we see based on the murder of Angela that there's clearly a system here. He attempted to use a fake name in Mexico. He secured a hotel room prior to finding a victim. He killed and hauled ass back to the U.S. border, where he seemed normal enough for border agents not to sense that anything was off. When he went back to living with his parents, working as a delivery driver while his victim's mother was still trying to call her phone to locate her daughter. This is clearly a calculated and planned attack, and with this level of confidence, Angela is very unlikely to have been the first. So what do you think? Is Bryant Rivera guilty? Let me know in that comment section down below. Let's talk about the Gilgo Beach murder. It was on May 1, 2010 when Shannon Gilbert from New Jersey got a call responding to her ad placed on Craigslist for sex work. The client had offered $400 for 2 hours and she accepted. In the early morning, she and her driver, Michael Pack, drove out to Long Island in the Ocean Park community in Suffolk County to meet the client at his home. Shannon went in alone, but Michael stayed outside waiting for the 2 hours to pass in the vehicle. Shannon had a system in place to keep herself safe. She always let her boyfriend know where she was going, and Michael stayed with her for the duration of the appointment. Shannon was 23 and from Ellenville, New York. She was highly intelligent, which allowed her to graduate at 16. She had dreams of becoming an actress and a singer and moved to New York City to pursue those dreams. And it was there at NYC when she'd been looking for work and responded to a modeling opportunity. However, there wasn't a real modeling gig, and Shannon soon found herself entangled in the sex work industry. She'd had a rocky start in life. Much of her childhood had been spent in foster care, bouncing from home to home. But she'd always been regarded as a sweet and caring woman with a take-no-shit attitude and was protective over those close to her. About an hour into the appointment, and it was reported that Shannon had started acting irrationally. She was suddenly terrified. The client approached Michael, asking him to get her out of his house, but Michael couldn't convince her to leave. She had locked herself in a room in the house and called 911. She refused to get in the car with Michael and was convinced that the men were trying to kill her. Michael doesn't know what she saw or what had happened in the home. He stated he'd never seen her like this before, and in the 911 call, she sounded intoxicated or drugged, but she'd been sober upon entering the home. Eventually, she fled on foot, banging on the doors of surrounding neighbors, begging for help. All the while, she still had 911 on the line and could be heard interacting with the neighbors, but she kept bolting from them as well. Michael was also trying to drive behind her, still trying to convince her to get into the car. She then suddenly turned down a trail and Michael couldn't follow her. He never saw anyone following her on foot and was frustrated by her odd behavior. He decided to leave, believing that she could get her own way home. The first neighbor she had approached had said that he also had tried to follow her. He had noted that there was a man following her on foot, but couldn't see who it was. When she turned down that trail, the man followed her, and from there she disappeared. And the 911 call ended abruptly. She had stayed on the call for over 22 minutes, and by the time law enforcement arrived, no one could find her. The client and the driver cooperated with police and were cleared of any wrongdoing. Shannon was not heard from again. When Shannon didn't come home that morning, her boyfriend attempted to file a missing persons report, but he claimed no one would file it for him. Shannon's mother, Mary Gilbert, eventually got that missing persons report filed, but it was only after being bounced from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And she claimed that New Jersey law enforcement didn't view the disappearance as a high concern. Mary called every day to multiple levels of law enforcement to keep someone searching for her daughter. It took 6 months before the 911 call was even connected to Shannon's disappearance. On December 11, 2010, Officer John Malia and his canine partner Blue, a trained cadaver dog, were doing a training exercise along Ocean Parkway in Oak Beach. A new FBI study had revealed that murder victims are often dumped close to a shoulder of a parkway. So that was where they had decided to train that morning. The area had heavy vegetation, and that morning was cold with the fresh dusting of snow. It had made the exercise more challenging for Blue, and Malia hadn't expected him to hit on anything. But then Blue started to alert. Officer Malia and Blue didn't find anything connecting to Shannon, but they did discover something that would start a massive murder investigation. They found a set of badly decomposed human remains inside a disintegrating burlap sack. There wasn't anything on or near the remains that would point to the identity of the person, and she was classified as a Jane Doe while they worked towards finding out who she was. Only 2 days later, 3 more sets of human remains were found nearby, less than 500 meters from the first Jane Doe. They were all called Jane Doe 1 through 4 while they worked to discover who these women were. These women would be nicknamed the Gilgo 4. The women were wrapped in burlap or other materials, were bound with either tape or belts. Law enforcement was able to identify the 4 victims as 25-year-old Maureen Brainerd Barnes, 27-year-old Amber Lynn Costello, 22-year-old Megan Waterman, and 24-year-old Melissa Barthelme. All 4 were similar in that they were all petite young women in their 20s, who at the time were working as sex workers, and they had all advertised their services on Craigslist or other similar sites. Though Melissa was the first body discovered, police would find that she was not the first victim of the 4 to go missing. Maureen was last seen in New York City on July 9, 2007. She was from Connecticut and had traveled to Manhattan for work. She was reported missing by a friend on July 14, 2007. Melissa was the second victim, who went missing on July 10, 2009. She had told a friend that she was going to go see a man and would be back in the morning, but she never came back. After not hearing from her for a few days, her mother reported her missing on July 18, 2009. Megan Waterman was last seen on June 6, 2010 at the Holiday Inn in Hatburg, New York at approximately 1:30 a.m. She had called her pimp saying that she was going to a convenience store near the hotel, but she wasn't heard from again. was reported missing on June 8, 2010, as her family was surprised she hadn't called to check in on her then 3-year-old daughter. Amber Lynn Costello was the last of these women to go missing, last seen on September 2, 2010. She was last seen at her residence in West Babylon. In the case of Amber, she had left her phone at home the night she went missing. Approximately the day before Amber had gone missing, she'd had a client come to her home where one of her roommates would pretend to be in and kicked up the client, keeping the money. The client was described as a large white male, approximately 6 feet 4 inches to 6 feet 6 inches in height, in his mid-40s with dark bushy hair and big oval-style 1970-type glasses. Her roommate described him as an ogre. He was seen leaving the residence in a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. The next day or later the same day, the exact timings are not confirmed by the roommate. The client had asked to see Amber again, but not at her home because of her quote-unquote boyfriend. Amber left her home, and it is assumed that she met with this client and was never seen again. It would start to become clear that the Gilgo Four were the victims of a serial killer. Law enforcement would start their search of the area again once the snow had melted in March 2011. With the help of the canine unit of cadaver dogs, police would continue the search for evidence and remains potentially connected to Shannan Gilbert. However, less than 3 weeks into their search, a 5th murder victim was found. Partial remains were found of the victim, who had already been known to law enforcement 8 years prior. In 2003, parts of a woman had been discovered in Manaville, a township nearby. The woman had been dismembered with a surgical instrument. The victim would later be identified as 20-year-old Jessica Taylor. Jessica is believed to have been working as a sex worker when she disappeared on July 26, 2003. She had disappeared from a bus stop in Manhattan. After finding more remains, the search continued and they found 3 more sets of remains on April 4, 2011. These discoveries would be a little different. They would discover the remains of an Asian male, still identified, believed to be between the ages of 17 and 23. With poor dental health and had been deceased for 5 to 10 years. His cause of death has been ruled a homicide, and it has been reported that he was killed in a different way from the other victims found in Gilgo Beach. The victim also appears to have suffered from a degenerative musculoskeletal disorder which may have caused them to walk with a limp. The victim was also found dressed in women's clothing, and they may have been transgendered. The other 2 victims found were the partial remains of a woman's head, hands, and right foot. She'd be given the name Jane Doe No. 6, and police would connect these remains to a torso that had been found in Manaville in November 2000. It would not be until May 2020 when she'd be identified as Valerie Mack via genetic genealogy. She had worked as sex worker and had gone missing shortly after the partial remains were found in November 2020. She had never been reported missing, which is why it took so much longer to identify her. The last set of remains found on April 4th were located very close to Mallory Mack and have yet to be identified. The remains were of a child aged between 18 to 24 months with an unknown cause of death. However, the toddler had been wrapped in a blanket and showed no visible signs of trauma, unlike the other victims. Along with the blanket, she was also wearing gold earrings and a gold necklace. She was given the name Baby Jane Doe. On the morning of April 11, 2011, police found 2 more partial sets of remains further down the Ocean Parkway, closer to Jones Beach. One of the sets of remains matched partial remains found on Fire Island, New York in 1996. Fire Island Jane Doe is also known as Jane Doe No. 7. And she is the most recently identified victim, with law enforcement announcing the discovery of her identity in August 2023. Fire Island Jane Doe is Karen Vergata, who was missing since 1996, making her one of the oldest victims. She had gone missing from Manhattan, and it is believed that she'd been working as a sex worker when she disappeared. The second set was originally not tied to this investigation, but in 2016, authorities announced that they had matched the remains with Jane Doe found in June 1997 in Lakeview, New York. Those remains were found in a large green Rubbermaid container. She had a visible tattoo of a peach, and she was given the name Peaches Jane Doe. Also at this time, they were able to confirm that Peaches was the mother of baby Jane Doe found on April 4, 2011. Peaches Jane Doe, baby Jane Doe, and the unidentified Asian person have yet to be identified. All the while this investigation was still ongoing, the search for Shannan Gilbert was still happening. Police and experts started to theorize whether the same person had killed all 10 victims. They were all disposed of in the same general area, but they didn't have all of the same MO, meaning that some were partial remains spread out in multiple places while others were intact, wrapped, and bound. Some would start to speculate that there were other killers who coincidentally all chose the same dumping ground to dispose of their victims. Others would theorize that the killer had aged and was not physically able to dispose of his victims the same way he had in the past. However, it could just be a matter of changing tactics to throw off law enforcement. We know that the Green River Killer would change up his method of disposal. He had tried to create random signatures to throw off detectives, and even staged bodies. But perhaps it's even a simpler explanation. Perhaps because it had taken law enforcement so long to find any of these victims, perhaps the killer didn't feel he needed to go through the much longer process of disposal than the first victims seemed to have had. Though the Gilgo Four were the first discovered, they were the last victims. The victims found later had been killed years prior. In December 2011, a year after the Gilgo Four had been discovered, police would finally find the remains of Shannon Gilbert. Her death would initially be considered inconclusive, and authorities have first announced that they believe she may have died by accident and is not connected to the other 10 homicides. The theory had been that she had gotten lost in the marsh and either drowned or died from exposure. Her body had been discovered in a marsh about half a mile from the path that she had last been seen on. Week before her body was found, some clothing had been found nearby and they were able to tie the clothing to Shannon. However, that conclusion didn't sit well with the family of Shannon, who requested a second opinion. Firstly, law enforcement had been out there less than an hour after the 911 call the night that Shannon had disappeared. They didn't report any sign of her. Secondly, her clothing was found separately and her bra had been cut cleanly between the cups. Lastly, the second autopsy revealed her hyoid bone had been punctured. That, along with the position of the body when it was found, led the second medical examiner to determine that Shannon had been strangled to death violently, making her murder similar to the other victims. Mary Gilbert was hailed as a hero for hounding law enforcement to search for Shannon, as had been that search that had led to the discovery of almost a dozen murder victims. Unfortunately, Mary was killed in 2016 by her other daughter, Sarah, who'd been experiencing a severe mental health episode. After the discovery of Shannon Gilbert's body, the press would report an outrage from people accusing law enforcement of not caring about all these missing people simply because they were sex workers. Then in 2016, the Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke was charged with multiple civil rights violations and conspiracy. It was discovered that Burke, a police officer since 1980, would arrest sex workers to take advantage of them while on duty and in uniform. He was caught physically assaulting a suspect in custody, and he was found to be attempting to cover up his crimes once he was caught and also threatening witnesses. Prior to his dismissal, he'd been the head of the Gilgo Beach murder investigations and for years had been actively blocking the FBI from aiding in the investigation. After Burke was convicted, the FBI took over. As far as suspects, there had been few leads. A profile had been released by the FBI saying they were looking for a likely white male. At the beginning of his killings, he would have been in his mid-20s to mid-40s. They stated that this man would be very familiar with the South Shore of Long Island and wouldn't stand out among residents. Many of the victims had been disposed of in burlap sacks, and access to burlap was noted as a possible route for identification. They also theorized that this man may have intimate knowledge of police techniques, which had helped him evade capture. The profile also explored the possibility of multiple killers. Over the years, there has been some speculation about who may have committed these crimes. John Bitrolf was convicted of murder in 2017 for the deaths of 2 sex workers in Suffolk County. He lived in the area and was an avid hunter and a carpenter by trade. Experts felt that both skills could have been utilized in the disposal of the victims' bodies. He was also connected to one of the victims, Melissa Bartholome. One of his murder victim's daughters was best friends with Melissa, and that Melissa was said to have had a client in Manaville where Fitzralph resided. And it was speculated that he may have had something to do with the Gilgo Beach murders. But no evidence had ever been connected to him. He's currently serving a 50-year sentence in prison and has denied involvement. Though the investigation was slow going, progress was being made. The next update from law enforcement wouldn't come until January 2020. When they released the first round of photo evidence to the public, images of a belt with the initials HM or WH. The next would be the identification of Valerie Mack in May 2020. In February 2022, law enforcement announced the creation of the Gilgo Beach Homicide Investigation Task Force. This would be a joint task force with local, state, and federal investigators coming together to work on the case as one. This was an announcement from the Suffolk County Police Commissioner, Rodney Harrison, who was appointed to the position in January 2022. Harrison said during the release, quote, "As I said on day one as police commissioner, I believe this case is solvable and identifying the person or people responsible for these murders is my top priority." He also added that some members of the group would meet daily. During the next few months, police released bits and pieces of information in the hopes of getting more tips from the public, hoping that it would lead to a killer. There wouldn't be any more major announcements until July 13, 2023, when it was announced that an arrest had been made in the case of the Gilgo 4. Authorities arrested 59-year-old Rex Hoyerman. Rex Hoyerman was an architect who ran a company called RH Consultants and Associates with their office located in Manhattan. The firm had been well respected, with several contracts with the U.S. federal government, New York City, as well as the Trump Corporation. He had lived in Long Island his whole life. Hoyerman was an avid hunter known to go on long hunting trips often. He attended high school with actor Billy Baldwin at the Massapequa's Burner High School and graduated in 1981. And shockingly, he was married with 2 grown children. His office was in Midtown Manhattan. His community had been shocked by his arrest, saying they didn't see anything suspicious from the man. He was described as large, a bit imposing, but no one could believe he was a killer. His wife had said she was shocked and knew nothing of his potential double life, and the two had been married for 27 years. He was arrested outside his Manhattan office and charged with first and second-degree murder in the cases of Melissa Barthelme, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. Police also strongly believe he was responsible for the death of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. At his arraignment hearing, he pleaded not guilty to all charges and has continued to state his innocence. After his arrest, bits and pieces of how they found Hoyerman as a suspect have now come out. One is phone records of both the victims and a burner phone believed to have been used by Hoyerman. A burner phone, or burner phone, is an inexpensive mobile phone designed for temporary, sometimes anonymous use, after which it may be discarded. It has also been released that the killer had used the phone of Melissa Bartholomew to call her 16-year-old sister Amanda with taunting phone calls after her death. The caller said, quote, "Is this Melissa's little sister? Do you know what your sister's doing? She's a whore." The caller then went on to go into explicit details about sexually assaulting and murdering her. The caller used Melissa's phone 7 times. One of the times, law enforcement had been able to ping the call coming from Midtown Manhattan close to Hoyerman's office. Evidence showed that the killer used Melissa, Megan, and Maureen's phones days after the disappearance to check their voicemails. And several other family members of the victims reported being harassed by someone claiming to know what had happened to their daughters. Hoyerman seized technology also showed an obsession not only with the victims and their cases but with the victims' family. He had been trying to find out who they were, where they lived, and how to contact them. The calls ended after his arrest, when he couldn't kill as a way to relive the thrill. Further evidence has burner phones believed to have been used by Hoyerman in contact with all 4 women before they disappeared and in locations where they were found and went missing. Melissa was contacted by a burner phone on July 6, 9, and 10 in 2009 before she went missing. Megan was contacted by a burner phone shortly after she left the hotel. The client Amber saw that day before she'd gone missing had also used a burner phone to contact her. Early on in the task force investigation in March 2022, they were able to confirm that Herman owned a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche during the time of the murders, specifically during the murder of Amber. As mentioned before, her roommate had said that the client that Amber had left with drove a Chevrolet Avalanche. Chevrolet Avalanche was seized from Rex Hoyerman's brother Craig's home in South Carolina after his arrest. They also discovered DNA evidence that has now been tied to Hoyerman. Hairs were found in some of the victims, specifically Maureen, Megan, and Amber. These hairs were from a woman and they had not belonged to the victims. And after going into Hoyerman's house, it is believed that the female hairs belonged to his wife, Asa Ellerup. One of Ellerup's hairs was specifically found in the belt, which had been found on Maureen. Authorities have yet to release how the initials are connected to Herman officially. A male hair was also found on Megan and it was tested against DNA from a pizza box that police watched Herman put in the trash outside of his office. The DNA found on the pizza was a match to the hair found on Megan. It has also been released that Ellerup was out of town during the times that Megan, Melissa, and Amber's disappearances. She's not considered a suspect, and neither she nor their grown children are believed to be involved in the murders. Ella Rupp has since filed for divorce after the arrest and has asked for privacy for her and her children. Additionally, at the time of his arrest, Rex Heuermann had a burner phone on him. The burner phone was connected to an email account known in court documents as Thok Email, which was linked to thousands of internet searches related to sex workers, sadistic, torture-related pornography, and inappropriate child materials. The email account was also used in more than 200 searches between March 2022 and June 2023 related to active and known serial killers, the specific disappearances and murders of Maureen, and the investigation into their murders. They also included searches into Long Island Sierra killers. Following the arrest, investigators spent almost 2 weeks going through the house of Heuermann. The news showed evidence being removed for days. The home was located in Massapequa Park, across from the bay where the remains were found. Investigators concluded their search of the home on July 25, 2023, after the Suffolk County, who is prosecuting this case, talked about the massive amounts of evidence that was collected from the home. He would not talk about the details of what was found, stating that first everything would have to be tested for trace evidence, then if needed, DNA. He also stated that the backyard was checked with ground penetrative technology, but nothing of note, meaning remains, were found in the backyard. Rex Heuermann was in possession of 92 handguns. They found a vault that contained both handguns and other rifles. Law enforcement described the vaults of weapons as an arsenal and concluded that there were up to 300 weapons. He also reported that the house was very cluttered and it would take time to review all of the evidence. Nothing more has been released of specifics found at the home. A sign could be seen on a fence outside the home that read, "No warrant, no entry," leaving it uninhabitable for her and her children. She was not seen at Heuermann's most recent court appearance on August 1, 2023. It was the first appearance since his arraignment. This was when prosecution put forth 13 years of evidence, stating this was only the first batch. Both Nevada and South Carolina authorities are also looking into links into other unsolved cases. Rex Heuermann owns a timeshare in Las Vegas that he's had since 2004. He also owns a large property in South Carolina, which he often visited. He is alleged to have said that he purchased the property to retire in. Law enforcement also seized several storage units owned by Heuermann. They have revealed that they were hoping to find trophies kept from the victims, anything that can tie him to the remaining murder victims. People who knew Rex Heuermann are starting to come forward with disturbing stories of what he was like before his arrest. One ex-coworker said that he even followed her onto a cruise. When he found her, he had stated, "I told you I could find you anywhere." Officials in New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, Las Vegas, and Connecticut are looking into their cold cases and missing person cases to see if there's any connections. Since his arrest, tips have been coming forward alleging a connection between Heuermann and cold case victims. One such cold case is that of missing person Julia Unbehaun, who's been missing since May 31, 2017. The tipster alleged to have seen Julia the day of her disappearance with a large man that matched Heuermann's appearance. There are also 2 other unidentified dismembered murder victims. The first is referred to as Cherry's Jane Doe, whose partial remains were found discovered in a suitcase in Harbor Island Park of New York. She was called Cherry's because of a tattoo that was found on her chest. Her cause of death was different than the others being established. Other portions of her body were discovered weeks later on the north shore of Long Island near Cold Spring Harbor in Oyster Bay. The other was skeletal remains of a woman near Oyster Bay. They were discovered on January 23, 2013 by a woman walking her dog. The remains showed signs of trauma and were wrapped in material that law enforcement has not yet released, making it more likely, in my opinion, that this one is strongly connecting back to Rex Heuermann. In summary, Rex Heuermann has been charged with the murder of Melissa Bartholome, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He remains the prime suspect in the murders of Maureen Brainard Varnes, Valerie Mack, Jessica Taylor, Karen Vegeta, Asian Meldo, Peaches Jane Doe, and Baby Jane Doe. We aren't going to know the full scope of evidence against Heuermann until his trial. The next court appearance is set for September 2023. His trial likely won't be until 2024. The DA is still working on evidence in the case of Maureen Brainard Varnes, including the DNA found on hairs previously released in the bail documents. Bartholomew's mother, Lynn Bartholomew, told NBC News, quote, "I'd like him to suffer at the hands of other inmates. Let him receive what the girls received. Death is too good for him. It's too easy." Has been placed on suicide watch. This case is still ongoing. Rex Heuermann has not been convicted of this crime and is still awaiting trial at this time. As there is still a lot of evidence to go through, there may still be further charges. It is believed that his trial will not start until 2024. What are your thoughts? Is there any doubt in your mind that Rex Heuermann is a serial killer? What evidence would solidify his guilt for you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below.